If you're a responsible gun owner, getting pulled over for a minor traffic violation can sometimes spiral out of control, especially if the cop wants to run the serial number on your firearm. But is the cop asking to do this even legal? Knowing the answer to this question could make the difference between you driving away free or ending up spending the night in handcuffs. In this video, I'm breaking down exactly what you need to know about your Fourth Amendment rights if cops decide they want to try to run the serial number on your gun. We'll talk about Supreme Court case law and what you need to say and what not to say if the cops try this with you. I'm Jeff Hampton, a former prosecutor turned the people's lawyer, and I want you to picture this scenario for a second. You're driving home after a great weekend of hunting, and then all of a sudden you see red and blue lights behind you and the cop pulls you over. Pulled over for a minor traffic violation, the cop walks up to your window and asks you, "Do you have any weapons in the car?" You immediately admit, "Yes, officer, I do have a firearm and it's right here secured in the center console." But then, without your permission, they then seize your gun and they run the serial number on the gun. Is that legal? This reminds me of a client. Take Tom, for example. He was riding home in his vehicle. He ended up being arrested over a clerical error with his gun. One evening, Tom was driving home after picking up his son from baseball practice. But then the police pulled him over for failing to signal a lane change. The officer then approached the car and started talking to Tom and asked him if he had any weapons inside. Tom admitted, "Yes, I've got a gun right here. It's concealed and I have a concealed carry permit." And so the officer then asked to be able to inspect the weapon, and he asked Tom to step out of the car. The officer then retrieved the handgun and ran the serial number on the gun. Moments later, the officer claimed that the gun had been stolen, and now Tom was being arrested on the spot. Tom was stunned. He had purchased a firearm from someone legally years ago. Of course, it was a terrible situation. His son was left in the car, stunned and confused, thinking his father had done something terrible. Now, can you imagine the fear and anxiety that Tom and his son felt at that moment? So what exactly went wrong here? Let's start the analysis by looking at whether the cops were able to legally seize the firearm during the traffic stop. Unfortunately, the moment a police officer learns that you have a firearm, in almost any court and anywhere in this country, they are allowed to legally justify under the guise of officer safety that they can now ask you to step out of the car and seize the firearm. In fact, the United States Supreme Court said in the case United States versus Robinson, and I quote, "Persons who are armed, whether legally or illegally, pose yet a greater safety risk to police officers." The court then went on to justify that officers are allowed to detain people under this situation based upon officer safety. However, what about cops now extending the time of the traffic stop investigation in order to be able to run the serial number on the weapon? This is where you want to fight this issue. In the Supreme Court case of Rodriguez versus United States, the Supreme Court very clearly articulated that police officers cannot extend the time of a traffic stop beyond the time necessary for the original reason of the stop. The court ruled that extending a traffic stop without reasonable suspicion of another crime having taken place now constitutes an unreasonable search and seizure. Now, let's combine that ruling with the ruling in Arizona versus Hicks. In this landmark Supreme Court case, the police entered Hicks' apartment after a shooting report. They then noticed some expensive stereo equipment that police thought looked out of place in this apartment. Suspecting that this stereo equipment had been stolen, the police then walked over, moved the stereo equipment, and actually made it available to be photographed and the serial numbers written down. The court held that moving the stereo equipment to see the serial number constituted a separate search that required its own independent probable cause. These cases are really important because they establish the precedent that if cops extend a traffic stop in order to be able to manipulate some type of object, whether it be stereo equipment or whether it be a firearm, in order to find a serial number, if they extend that traffic stop, it could constitute an illegal search and seizure under the Fourth Amendment. Back to Tom's story. We dug deep into the circumstances there and we found out that the actual firearm had been reported stolen because of a clerical error. There had been an improper entry into the database about that serial number. But the bigger issue was whether the officer had the right to run the serial number in the first place. The argument was that Tom's Fourth Amendment rights had been violated and that it was an illegal search. Think about this. The firearm was secured, it posed no threat, Tom was committing no separate crimes that would constitute a search of the vehicle, so how was this a legal search? Eventually, Tom's charges had been dropped, but not before he went through this entire nightmare of an ordeal. All of this brings us to a discussion about the plain view doctrine. Under this doctrine, if police officers can see anything in plain view and it somehow constitutes contraband, they can now seize that evidence without having a warrant or needing any other probable cause. However, the key under the plain view doctrine is that it must be in plain sight and it must be immediately apparent that it's illegal. In other words, all bets are off if the cops have to manipulate things within the car, like say a gun to look at the serial number, or let's say stereo equipment in order to see the serial number, in order to determine if it's illegal. So let's break this down. Let's say an officer walks up and in the context of a firearm, let's say they can just see it sitting there on the passenger seat. And in the position that it's in, if they can actually see the serial number in plain view, and they're able to take down that number and go run the serial number, there's a good chance that could be legal. But if they have to pick it up, move it, or manipulate it in any way in order to see that serial number, that's where these constitutional protections come into play. Let me introduce you to Maria, a single mother who works as a security guard and works late nights. She was pulled over for another routine traffic stop because her rear license plate light was out. She then, like she was supposed to, informed the officer, because she was in a duty to inform state, she informed the officer that she had a firearm in the car, and the officer then asked her to step out of the car. They then grabbed and detained that weapon, seized that weapon, and then without any permission or any other probable cause of any crime, they ran the serial number. Maria felt uneasy about the whole situation, but she didn't protest it. She was smart about how she handled it. But she did reach out to me and she said, "Jeff, look, was this legal? I don't feel like the cops handled this situation the right way." It's crucial that you analyze this question based upon your state laws, because state laws can vary substantially. Some states are very pro-gun rights. Others, you can get arrested for merely having the weapon. Here in Texas, where Maria was pulled over, we have the Motorist Protection Act. This allows you to carry a concealed firearm in your car without a license, provided that you're not committing a crime like drug possession, DWI, or anything other than a Class C misdemeanor traffic ticket. However, this law does not give law enforcement total authority to be able to search your car whenever they want or run your serial number on your gun. In other states like California and New York, they are way more restrictive on gun possession, and this situation can get very serious and end up being charged with a felony crime. So the point is, always familiarize yourself with your state laws. But this brings me to my next point, something that really bothers me when I have to talk about it, and that's what cops are allowed to do in the name of officer safety. Because traffic stops are one of the most dangerous situations for the police, courts have granted them much more authority to be able to seize a firearm during a traffic stop, even if you're not committing any type of crime. The way they are able to do this is if they find out that you have a weapon, they can temporarily detain you in order to make sure that their officer safety is not at risk. In fact, in the case of Pennsylvania versus Mims, the court specifically held that cops can legally require you to get out of your car if they can articulate a specific reason and basis for why they believe their officer safety is at risk. Extending that same logic from Pennsylvania versus Mims, many courts have now also allowed officers to extend that to being able to take and detain your firearm during a traffic stop as well. But here is the fine line. Securing a weapon for officer safety is one thing, but manipulating that weapon and now running the serial number on it to see if it's illegal, that's a whole different matter. Running a serial number on a gun requires a much higher standard where the police are going to have to provide specific probable cause in order to pass the constitutional test. So where does this leave us? Can cops actually run the serial number on your gun? I hate to say this, it likely depends on where you live. Like I said, in more protective states, more constitutionally limited states like New York, California, New Jersey, there's a good chance they're going to allow cops to be able to run the serial number on the gun because as soon as they find out about the gun, you're going to be arrested. But in other states, we know that Supreme Court law allows the officer to get you out of the car and technically seize the weapon. But what they do to extend the length of that traffic stop can be the basis for you to get the traffic stop thrown out. So what exactly can you do to protect yourself, and how can you stop cops from running the serial numbers on your gun? Number one, never consent to a search. Unless you are required to disclose that you're carrying a firearm in your state with a permit, there is absolutely no reason for you to disclose that you have a firearm in your vehicle. And if the cops ask if it's okay if they can search your car, you can politely say, "Officer, I appreciate your question, but I do not consent to a search of my vehicle. Am I free to go?" You are not going to look guilty just because you refuse consent to search. It is your constitutional right to do so. And in fact, if they find out that you have a weapon in the vehicle, things are going to get tense very quickly and they can get dangerous. Think about this. A police officer now, once he finds out you have a firearm, he's got a checklist of things he's looking for. Do I smell the odor of alcohol on his breath? Let me do a full search of this vehicle. If I can find any paraphernalia or any drugs, I now can make an arrest. Or if I think his nervousness or his fidgetiness, or maybe he's acting and making furtive movements, that may be a sign that he's intoxicated, and now maybe I need to arrest him for DWI. The moment they start a DWI investigation, they can use your supposed intoxication as a basis to now arrest you for unlawfully carrying a weapon. Don't invite trouble into your life. Decide from the very beginning, refuse to consent. Know your rights. Familiarize yourself with not only the constitutional laws like you're doing today on this video, but also your individual state laws, particularly if you have a concealed carry permit and if you're traveling, those reciprocity agreements, and you want to know how to handle police officers in the state that you're in. In fact, check out my other video on what to do to protect yourself when you travel in other states. But either way, it's important that you educate yourself on this, or your lack of knowledge could actually land you in jail. Number 3, be diligent about your rights, but don't fight officers with their commands. If you're carrying a weapon and you are being asked specifically if you have a weapon and you have a permit and there's a duty to disclose, make sure and tell the officer. Because if you don't tell him and he already knows you have a concealed carry permit, you're now putting yourself in a bad spot because the officer thinks you're hiding something, and now he's going to turn this into a full-bore investigation. If cops now know that you have a gun, move very slowly. Do not ever grab a gun in the presence of a police officer, and always tell the officer what you're about to do before you do it. Always let the officer grab for the gun. Number 4, ask only the right questions. If an officer wants to run your firearm serial number, you can politely ask if you're being detained or if they have probable cause. We already covered that you can refuse consent to search your vehicle, but if the officer is getting unreasonable and he's demanding to be able to see your gun, always move slowly and ask the officer to please reach in and grab the gun. The worst thing you can possibly do is grab for a gun. I've seen this happen so many times that can turn very quickly into a fatal mistake. Number 4, stay calm. The worst thing you can possibly do is mix emotion, a police officer, and a gun. Keep a level head. If the officer starts acting nervous, don't borrow his nervousness to elevate your own. Emotions are the number one reason traffic stops go sideways. Number 5, if you can do so, turn on your phone's recording, not only audio but video. Get the badge number of the officer. Try to grab as much information as you can and document every bit of this, so that way you're able to show what actually happened as opposed to what the officer is going to write up in his report. But the number one thing that you can do to stop cops and protect yourself from an officer trying to extend the traffic stop in order to investigate you to run your serial number on your gun is to ask the officer very plainly. Let's say he pulls you over for a supposed traffic stop for speeding. And then what starts off as him writing up a traffic ticket then starts leading into 5-10 minutes of questioning about whether you have a gun in your car and wanting to search your vehicle. That can then lead to, "Officer, I exercise my right to remain silent. I refuse to answer any questions without my lawyer present. Am I free to go?" In that moment, and I would record this by the way, In that moment, you are setting a line in the sand. You are letting the officer know this is not a consensual encounter. I do not consent to this conversation. And the longer the officer keeps you on the side of the road, longer than it would necessarily be to write you a speeding ticket, the higher the probability that anything this officer does after that would be ruled illegal and thrown out in court. This is just the beginning, though. What if cops now pull you over and they see that you're carrying a gun in a case? Can they legally demand to search your gun case without a warrant? Check out this next video where I break down how to stop cops from searching your gun case. I break it all down. See you over there.